So, good morning, everyone. I'm Maggie Greenfield. I'm the Director of Programs and Development at the Bronx River Alliance, and I'm really pleased to be here. I want to thank the organizers of this summit today for getting me out of my own watershed, bringing me down here to the Gowanus, where I get to learn a lot, and I already have about 15 questions for Andrea, and share some of the design challenges and opportunities that we have encountered on the Bronx River that I think have some relevance for the Gowanus Canal. So before I get into that, though, I thought I'd give a bit of historic and geographic context of the Bronx River and the Bronx River Alliance. We are a public-private partnership, which means in our case we work really closely with the New York City Department of Parks and Recreation, but also over 100 different local community-based organizations, regional nonprofits, businesses, and all levels of government to fulfill our mission. And our mission is to protect, improve, and restore the Bronx River corridor so that it can be a healthy resource for the communities through which the river flows. So where does the river flow? It is 23 miles long, and its headwaters are impounded, which means they're behind a dam, up at the Kensico Reservoir in Valhalla, New York. And from there it flows down through southern Westchester County and then right down through the heart of the Bronx before it empties into the East River, right at the point where Long Island Sound and New York Harbor come together. So it is New York City's only freshwater river, as I believe Adrian mentioned earlier, and so it has some really unique habitats and unique wildlife, including our beaver. So I don't know how many people know, but beaver, of course, are really historic to New York City. The local economy was based on the beaver trade. They're even on the New York City flag, but they disappeared from New York City up until 2007. So after an absence of 200 years, they came back, and researchers in the zoo discovered them and promptly named, actually the one, Jose, after Jose Serrano, our congressman, who was so instrumental in helping to raise awareness and bring resources to the Bronx River. So let's see if this works. Here is the beaver captured on night cam at the New York Botanical Garden. Yay, it worked. I love that little just turning thing. This was my first attempt at embedding a GIF into a PowerPoint, so yay, I'm so glad it worked. And now there's some speculation that we actually have two beaver on the river, and the zoo unfortunately had a naming contest for this one, and the crowd picked Justin, so we have Justin Beaver joining Jose on the river. So the Bronx River is a historic river. It, of course, was a source of sustenance for the Native Americans who lived, the Lenape people who lived along its banks. Later, it was what attracted Europeans to the area for the beaver, but also as a source of irrigation for crops and later to power mills. One of the first settlers to the area was a Swede named Jonas Bronk, and his farmland abutted this river that then became known as Bronx River. So that's the river actually is then what gave the name to the borough of the Bronx, and some historians actually surmise that that's the reason why the Bronx has a "the" in front of it, is because it's actually a shortening of the borough of the Bronx River. So, despite the fact that the river is long and linear and obviously flows in one direction, the history of the river is a bit cyclical. And by that I mean that we've gone through periods of abuse and neglect. In the late 19th century, there actually was an early effort to restore the river and bring it back. And then in the 20th century, mid-20th century, we fell into another period of abuse and neglect. And I'm not going to get into all that history, but just suffice it to say, by the 1970s, this was not an uncommon sight along the lower Bronx River. It had really turned into just a neglected dumping ground. And we, as a city, had turned our backs on the river, as had many cities across the country turned their backs on their urban waterways. So it was this sorry state of affairs that led, as Adrian mentioned, the kind of first initial group and what we can really consider our predecessor group called Bronx River Restoration to come together. And these were artists and volunteers and even police officers who really thought, this river can be something more than it is right now. Let's work to make something happen here. And they organized some of the early volunteer events on the river. They started bringing students down to do water quality monitoring on the river. And they developed a master plan. So yes, I also agree. Sometimes a plan can be a good thing. And in this master plan is the first place I know of that the Bronx River Greenway was articulated. So this idea of a continuous series of parks and trails along the full 23 miles of the river. So the efforts of Bronx River restoration really got new energy in the late 1990s when a new generation of community leaders came to the fore. And these were folks who really came out of the environmental justice movement and who really saw the Bronx River as kind of a rallying point and a symbol for both the sort of everything that is wrong about the borough right now and everything that it can become. And they formed a Bronx River working group. This was actually a project that was supported by Partnerships for Parks. And this working group was all volunteer-based, and they were so successful, they brought together over 60 different community organizations and public agencies and businesses and raised $60 million. And so at that point, they said, okay, you know what, this effort really has legs. We need to form a nonprofit to sort of watchdog these funds and to serve from here on out as a liaison between communities and government. And that's where the Bronx River Alliance came from. We were founded in 2001, and since that time, we've helped bring additional resources to the river. I believe the total is now up to about almost $200 million that's been dedicated to river restoration and greenway projects. We have a conservation crew that's out on the river every day doing restoration projects, and they've planted over 100,000 trees, shrubs, and other plants along the river corridor, working with volunteers who have dedicated over 100,000 hours to projects along the river. And we've also created 22 new acres of parkland, of course, working really closely with the New York City Department of Parks, in the South Bronx, as well as additional 4 miles of trail. So now I'm going to launch into some of these design challenges and opportunities that I think that we face and I think have some relevance for the Gowanus. And the first is this issue of site contamination. I could have just as easily really called this slide, however, coalition building, because I really think that's the reason for our success here at Starlight Park, which is this first case I want to just present to you guys today. So Starlight Park is a beautiful 13-acre park on the Bronx River in the South Bronx. It just reopened last year, and when it reopened, we really celebrated because that park had been closed for well over a decade. And the reason why it had been closed was because of the discovery of extensive soil contamination and the revelation that the site was a former manufactured gas plant. And I understand the Gowanus Canal also has at least one of these three of these sites along its banks. But for the uninitiated, manufactured gas plants, they operated in the late 19th to early 20th century. And what they did was they converted coal and oil into a gas that could be used for cooking and heating and powering street lamps. And the process was very polluting. So they produced substances that we know today as volatile organic compounds like benzene and PAHs. And of course, at the time, there was really no understanding of the human health effects of exposure to these chemicals and no protocols for their proper disposal. So what did they do with these substances that were a byproduct? They just dumped them into the ground. So flash forward about 80 years, the State Department of Transportation approaches Parks Department because they need to build a drainage system off the Sheridan Expressway. And they say, hey, you know, there's this little park there, and it's just an asphalt lot with a chain link fence around it. We have to dig it up for our drainage project, but we'll rebuild it, and it'll be much nicer than what's there now. It'll look like this. It'll be part of this Bronx River Greenway that everybody's talking about. So it was like a win-win situation, and they agreed. Now what happened, however, was when the state went in to do the excavation to lay these pipes, they discovered all the contamination. And of course, the process just ground to a halt because they had to identify the responsible parties, and they had to agree with the regulators in the city and local communities around the standard of cleanup and the protocols for doing so. So of course, in these kinds of processes, there's a natural tension, right? The responsible parties are concerned about cleanup costs. Communities are concerned about exposure of chemicals to their families and neighbors. And often there can be an imbalance of power in those kinds of dynamics. But I think what was really significant in this case was that there was already a community of people who were organized and mobilized for the river in that Bronx River working group I mentioned earlier. So one group, particularly Youth Ministries for Peace and Justice, which operates in the Bronx River neighborhood, was able to bring in additional legal resources through the New York Lawyers for the Public Interest and negotiate at the table with the regulators and the responsible parties and really come up with what I think now everyone agrees was a high standard of cleanup. In fact, they removed 45,000 tons of soils from the site, and brought in 3 to 6 feet of clean fill. So I just think that's something that, although I think it's not often thought of as a design solution, I've heard it mentioned a couple times today, so I think, kudos to all of us that we're thinking about those kinds of things. I think, we don't often know the value of coalitions and organized communities until we really need them, and so it's, I think, just an important thing to consider in the design process. My second case I want to mention, or the second issue, is water quality. I know we share this concern with the Gowanus Canal, and I don't know if how many people saw this article in the Daily News that came out last year. Report, Bronx River is almost as bad as the Gowanus Canal for fecal bacteria. So it seems as though our local paper is trying to pit us in this rivalry about who can claim this title of worst water quality. And of course, nobody wants this title, and we all want to work together to make sure that the city does find a robust solution to the CSO problem. We've been involved in a citywide coalition, as I know GCC has as well, called SWIM, Stormwater Infrastructure Matters, that's helped kind of get this issue, we believe, before the city in a pretty exciting way. The Bronx River Alliance has been interested in green infrastructure before it was called a green infrastructure. I think we called it best management practices there for a while. And in fact, we've developed master plans for the river, including the Shoelace Park Master Plan. That was another EPF, Environmental Protection Fund, supported project that did a lot with thinking about how we could use the Bronx River Greenway, kind of similar to the Brooklyn Greenway, for green infrastructure. But of course, you can't do it all right at the water's edge. It has to be a watershed approach. And so we were really thrilled when the city put out its 2010 Green Infrastructure Plan with its goal of a 10% reduction of runoff from impervious surfaces. We've also seen some of the pilot efforts that have started implementation in the Bronx River watershed, and some of the design challenges that have emerged in the Bronx. It's that we have high bedrock. And so what that means for some of these right-of-way bioswales is that there's just not enough room for the water to percolate before it really has nowhere to go. And so there's been some situations where we thought we were going to get, a big neighborhood rollout of green infrastructure, and it's not able to happen. So we really do still think the city can achieve that 10% reduction, but may need to look for some other ways to do it in areas that have this, bedrock issue or other kinds of issues. We think private property is kind of a no-brainer in a lot of ways. If we can look at ways to create more incentives for private property owners who have large swaths of impervious surfaces like parking lots or roofs to implement this, then I think that could be a way to keep moving. Just quickly, because I know we're under constraint for time, water quality monitoring continues to be a way that we just engage local communities in this somewhat technical conversation around CSOs and water quality and what is green infrastructure. And it's something that our predecessor group, Bronx River Restoration, started 30, 40 years ago on the Bronx River, and we just still find to be a really useful tool. Before I move on to my last case, I just think right now we have a real opportunity to engage with the city around the CSOs. The city is currently developing long-term control plans for all of the water bodies. And another interesting parallel between the Bronx River and the Gowanus Canal, they're due out in June of next year. There is a public outreach process as part of the development of those plans, and we're already starting to try to spread the word among our constituencies to make sure that when the Bronx River hearings take place, that we think they'll be in the spring, that we have a lot of people in the room ready to talk about what the Bronx River means to them and why it's important to have, again, a high standard of cleanup. So lastly, it's been interesting that other people have really brought this up today, but I do think it's really important that it's just a real balancing act. I think it's true for any urban river restoration project. It's not just about public open space and opening up access. It's not just about ecological restoration. It's also about working to find ways to integrate a working waterfront into those goals, both for its significance to the regional economy, but also because of what it means for local neighborhoods like Hunts Point, where jobs are really important. So we're not dismayed to see active recycling facilities next to our new park, as Adrian mentioned earlier. In fact, Sims Metal Management is a case really of what an enlightened industry can do well. When Hunts Point Riverside Park opened, they relocated the kind of smellier side of their operation to the far side of their lot. But then they went further. They implemented a plan to capture 100% of the stormwater on their site so that they're not contributing at all to pollution in the river. And they developed, kind of put forth a friendly face to the residential community by developing a green wall with murals painted by local artists. So I think there's no magic formula for how to get that right. Local context, means so much. But I think there's some interesting things happening on the Bronx River, and invite you guys to come out and find us. We have a few more paddling trips left this season, including the first 2 weekends in November. We'll be at the Botanical Garden leading trips. And then in May is our amazing Bronx River Flotilla, which is a great opportunity to get it down and paddle the whole river. Or come and bike and walk and run with us. There's lots of things going on the Bronx River. So thank you.